My elder brother believed he could force me to toil at the company I founded. The look on his face when I exposed my hidden strategy made every ounce of humiliation worth it. I thought I was finally free. I just exposed my greedy brother, watched him get arrested, and felt this wild rush of triumph as the cops dragged him away. But that morning, as Mom stood there, tears streaming down her face with those men behind her, I realized my revenge hadn't just destroyed Parker, it had unleashed a nightmare that threatened to consume us all. What the hell had I done? For 3 long years, after Dad had his stroke, my older brother, Parker, had been a dictator. The will said we'd split the hardware store equally when he turned 30, but until then, full control was his. And he used it to make my life a living hell. Every single morning, I was there at 5:30 a.m., breaking my back unloading trucks, while Parker would finally stroll in around noon, usually still reeking of last night's booze. He'd watch me struggle with heavy boxes and just laugh, saying, "Finally learning what real work means, huh?" It was infuriating. I'd been helping Dad since I was 12. But to our customers, I was just some random employee. Parker never told them I was his brother, never mind that half of everything they were buying was technically mine. He kept all the store's money, paying me so little I could barely afford my crappy apartment after rent. When I dared to ask for more, he'd sneer, "You should be grateful I even gave you a job. Nobody else would want someone as useless as you." He loved making me look stupid, especially in front of customers. Watch my little brother try to lift that ladder, he'd bellow, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is gonna be hilarious." He'd even invite his friends to hang out at the store, making me fetch them sodas and snacks like I was their personal waiter, while they openly mocked my pathetic uniform. Then he started dating Delia, my ex-girlfriend. The same Delia who dumped me right after Dad's stroke, claiming I had no future. Parker would bring her into the store every single day, making me wait on them while they practically made out against the counter I'd just cleaned. Delia, oh man, she'd order me around, sending me to the back storage room for specific items, just to watch me run back and forth. "Your brother actually knows how to run a business," she'd purr, glancing at Parker who'd be counting cash right in front of my face, unlike some people who just whine about everything. Parker started showering her with expensive stuff from the store, power tools for her dad, paint for her apartment, writing it off as damaged goods. He was basically stealing from our inheritance to impress my ex, and I had to watch it happen, day in and day out. I was seething. But then I discovered the truth. Parker had been lying about the store's profits, siphoning money into a separate account only he could access. He'd made me believe we were barely surviving, but we were actually booming thanks to all the downtown construction. I found the real books, hidden in Dad's old desk, and my blood ran cold. Parker had stolen over $100,000, money that should have been saved for when we split everything. The really sick part? I found out he was planning to sell the store to developers next month, right before his 30th birthday. So I'd never get my half at all. He'd even signed preliminary papers and taken a massive cash deposit, hidden in Delia's name, making it impossible for me to trace. I knew exactly what would destroy Parker worse than anything else, losing to me, publicly. So, I called the owner of the competing hardware store, Chad. I offered him our customer list and supplier contracts if he'd help me expose Parker. Chad jumped at it. He'd wanted our customers for years, and Parker had always acted like he was better than everyone else in town. We arranged for him to show up during the town's busiest Saturday, armed with proof of everything Parker had done, the stealing, the secret sale. The whole town would see Parker exposed as a thief and a liar, right there in the store our father built with his bare hands. It would obliterate his reputation forever. That Saturday, I watched Parker's face drain of all color as Chad walked in with a lawyer and started reading out loud every single accusation. Customers stopped shopping, their heads swiveling to listen. Delia ran out crying when she realized how much trouble they were both in. "You think you beat me, but you just destroyed Dad's legacy, you selfish piece of garbage." Parker screamed at me, his voice raw with fury. I just looked him dead in the eye, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Actually, I saved it from you. Thieves don't deserve inheritances." Parker lunged, trying to punch me, but the cops were already there. They arrested him for theft and fraud. I took over the store that afternoon. Parker went to jail. Everyone in town called me a hero for stopping him. Everything felt perfect. Until the next morning. I opened the store, and their mom was standing by the front counter, tears streaming down her face, clutching a crumpled letter. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Your brother wasn't stealing that money because he was keeping it for something else entirely." Behind her stood 3 men in expensive suits who definitely didn't look like lawyers. "Your father," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, "owed these men $500,000. Parker," she explained, "had been paying them off, trying to keep them from taking everything, including our house." She looked at the men, then back at me, her eyes pleading. "Now that he's in jail, they want the rest of the money from you. Today. Or else." The tallest one stepped forward. I could smell his expensive cologne, mixing with Mom's perfume and the comforting scent of sawdust from the shelves around us. His suit probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and the way he moved, it reminded me of those nature shows, where the predator just knows the prey has nowhere to run. Mom's shoulders shook harder. The shorter guy, with a scar above his eyebrow, barked at her to stop making noise. "It's bad for business." That snapped me back to reality. My work boot squeaked on the floor I'd mopped an hour ago as I stepped between them and Mom. The one in charge, Keith Vasquez, looked at me with cold, gray eyes. "We need to have a conversation about your family's obligations," he said, his voice like ice. I stammered that I needed time to figure out what was happening, but Keith just smiled, a chilling, humorless smile, and said, "Time is something you can't afford anymore." Mom's hands trembled as she pushed a crumpled envelope towards me. I grabbed it, the paper damp from her tears. My eyes jumped to Dad's signature at the bottom of something called a confession of judgment, dated 3 years ago, right after his stroke. The number at the top made my legs weak. $500,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. I flipped through the pages and found a payment schedule. $20,000 every single month, with Parker's initials next to each payment date, going back years. Keith cleared his throat. "Reasonable men understand business is business," he said. "Family debts don't just disappear because one person can't pay anymore." He gestured around the store. "We'll give you exactly 1 week to figure out how to keep the payments going, or we take the store. Your house. Everything." I tried to keep my voice steady. I told him I needed to check the store's finances before I could promise anything. Keith nodded, as if expecting that answer, and motioned for his guys. They walked past the paint display I'd just reorganized, leaving Mom and me standing there in the middle of the store Dad built. The second their car pulled away, I ran to the office. I yanked open drawers, pulled the cash bag from the safe, dumped the register contents onto the desk. Bills scattered everywhere as I counted with shaking fingers. $8,000 in cash. Maybe another $15,000 in the checking account if the morning deposits had cleared. My hands wouldn't stop trembling when I did the math. We were almost $20,000 short for this month's payment alone. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through Dad's old contacts until I found Ryan Garrison, the attorney who'd helped with the store's incorporation years ago. Ryan answered on the 3rd ring. I begged him to see me right away, my voice cracking as I explained about the men and the debt. He told me to calm down and, absolutely, not to give anyone any money until he looked at the documents. Something about his steady voice made my heart stop racing quite so hard. Ryan said he could meet me at 4 p.m. and to bring everything I had, especially any papers the men left behind. I spent the rest of the morning trying to run the store like normal, but customers kept coming in, buzzing about Parker's arrest from yesterday. An older lady who bought birdseed every week patted my arm and said I was brave for exposing a thief, even family. A contractor picking up lumber shook my hand, telling me the town needed more people with integrity like me. Each compliment felt like swallowing glass because they didn't know. They didn't know Parker had been protecting all of us while I was planning my revenge. I had to escape to the back room twice when the guilt made it hard to breathe, leaning against the metal shelving, trying not to throw up. The second time I came back out, Mom was standing by the register, her eyes red, a tissue clutched in her hand. She admitted she'd known about men visiting Parker late at night for months, but she thought it was just small gambling debts or something manageable. Her voice broke completely when she told me Dad had invested everything in some land development deal right before his stroke. Some project that was supposed to set us up for life. I'd never seen her look so small, so defeated. Like the weight of this secret had been crushing her for years. After she left, I went back to Dad's old desk, pulling out files I'd ignored before, when I was just looking for evidence against Parker. Under a stack of supplier invoices, I found a folder marked Riverside Development in Dad's handwriting. The papers inside showed Dad had partnered with 3 investors on a 100-acre project outside town, supposed to become a shopping center. The environmental reports were all stamped approved, but someone had scrawled fraudulent across them in red pen. A letter from the EPA stated the land was contaminated, would cost millions to clean up, making it utterly worthless. The investor names at the bottom of the contracts weren't familiar, but their company address, it was in the city where Keith and his friends probably came from. Everything Parker had done suddenly made terrible sense, and I had to sit down in Dad's old chair to keep from falling over. I pulled out the real books I'd found before, the ones showing Parker's supposed theft, and compared them to Keith's payment schedule. Every single withdrawal Parker made matched a payment date perfectly. $20,000 on the 15th of each month, like clockwork. He hadn't been stealing to buy Delia fancy things or to sell the store behind my back. He'd been bleeding our business dry to keep these men from taking everything. The weight of what I'd done hit me so hard I couldn't breathe right. I pictured Parker's face when the cops dragged him away yesterday. After closing the store, I drove 20 minutes to the care facility where Dad had been since his stroke, needing to see him, even though he couldn't talk anymore. The receptionist mentioned they were worried about his payment being 2 weeks late and asked if everything was okay. I realized Parker had been juggling that too, trying to keep Dad comfortable while paying off his debts and running the store I'd accused him of destroying. Dad was sleeping in his bed by the window, his face peaceful, like he had no idea his son's relationship was destroyed forever because of his mistakes. I left the care facility and drove back to the store as the sun was setting, my hands still shaking on the wheel. The parking lot was empty, except for a few cars at the bar across the street. I fumbled with my keys at the back door. Inside, the store felt different now, like every shelf and tool was watching me, knowing what I'd done to the brother who'd been protecting all of this. I started my closing routine, counting the register, checking that all the doors were locked, but kept stopping to look out the windows. A black sedan had been parked across the street for 20 minutes, and nobody had gotten out. When I finally finished locking up and walked to my car, the sedan's engine started. Its headlights came on. I practically ran to my car and drove home, taking 3 different routes to make sure nobody was following me. My apartment building's parking lot had never looked more exposed. I checked behind me 5 times, walking to my door. Inside, I poured myself a drink from the bottle Parker had left here months ago, when he'd crashed on my couch after a fight with Delia. The burn of the cheap whiskey made sense now. Why he needed something to dull the constant fear of those men showing up. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound in the hallway, checking the locks over and over. My phone rang at 7 o'clock the next morning. Ryan Garrison's name showed on the screen. He wanted to meet that afternoon and told me not to give those men any money until he looked at everything. He said, "Sometimes these debts can be challenged if we play it smart." His voice was calm, professional. He was the first person who seemed to have an actual plan instead of just threats or tears. After hanging up with Ryan, my phone started ringing nonstop with calls from the store employees. Word had gotten out about financial problems, and they all wanted to know if they still had jobs. I told them everything was fine, but my voice cracked, and they could tell I was lying. These weren't just employees. These were families who depended on those paychecks for rent, for food, for their kids' school supplies. Old Jim, who'd worked for Dad for 20 years, asked if he should start looking for other work, and I couldn't give him a straight answer. After the 5th call, I stopped answering and let them go to voicemail. I went to the store early, digging through the supplier invoices Parker kept in a filing cabinet behind the counter. The organization was a mess. papers stuffed in random folders, bills mixed with receipts. As I sorted through them, my stomach dropped further with each past due notice. 2 suppliers had already put us on credit hold. One was threatening legal action for $30,000 in unpaid bills. The invoices had notes in Parker's handwriting about payment plans and promises to pay, but nothing official. Our biggest supplier of power tools had a final notice dated last week, saying they'd stop all shipments if we didn't pay $15,000 immediately. Without inventory, we couldn't fill orders. Without orders, we had no income to pay anyone. The math was simple and brutal. Mom showed up around noon with sandwiches neither of us could eat. She suggested we should just sell the store, fast, to pay off the debt. I told her Dad built this place. We couldn't just give it up. But she pointed out that Parker had thought the same thing. And look where that got him, she said. She wasn't being mean, just practical. But the comparison to Parker stung, because I was starting to understand how trapped he'd felt. We argued for an hour, her crying and me getting louder, until she left, saying I was, just like my father, too stubborn to see reality. That evening, Keith and 2 other men came back to the store just as I was closing. Keith handed me a formal default notice with legal language about acceleration clauses and confession of judgment. He explained the week was a courtesy, but they expected to see good faith progress, or they'd have to take more aggressive action to protect their interests. The threat was polite but clear, and one of the other men kept his hand in his jacket pocket the whole time. Mom had been waiting in her car and came inside when she saw them, immediately starting to cry again when Keith told her to make sure I understood the seriousness of the situation. After they left, I locked myself in Dad's office and finally read the whole letter about his investment. The Riverside development deal was supposed to turn 100 acres of farmland into a shopping center with 3 anchor stores and 40 smaller shops. Dad had put in $200,000 cash, plus signed personal guarantees for another $300,000 in loans. The environmental reports showing clean soil were completely fake. The EPA had condemned the land as too contaminated to build on. The cleanup alone would cost $5 million, making the land worthless. Dad's signature was on every page, along with 3 other investors whose names I didn't recognize, but whose address was the same building where Keith worked. The paperwork showed Dad knew about the contamination 2 weeks before his stroke, but never told anyone. My phone buzzed. A voicemail from Parker. His voice sounded broken when he asked if Mom was safe and warned me about the men. He said he was sorry for everything, that he'd tried to handle it alone to protect us. I listened to it 3 times. Each time, I heard more pain in his words, more exhaustion from carrying this secret. Ryan sent an email outlining our options: bankruptcy, negotiating a settlement, or trying to invalidate the debt based on fraud. He warned that these men operated in gray areas where legal protections only went so far, and we needed to be creative and careful. My phone buzzed again, a text from Chad Coulter, asking if the rumors about our money troubles were true and offering to talk if I needed help. In our small town, news traveled fast, and soon everyone would know the family store was in trouble. Mom showed up at the store again that night after I'd locked up. She finally started telling me things about Parker I never knew. She said he'd come home drunk at 2 or 3 in the morning and sit at the kitchen table crying about how he couldn't figure out how to save us all. He made her promise never to tell me because he wanted me to have at least one chance at a normal life without this weight on my shoulders. She showed me texts from him, begging her not to say anything when I started working at the store. My chest got tight. I had to sit down on the box of nails I'd been about to reshelve. The next morning, I went back to Dad's old desk and dug deeper into the files I'd missed before. Under a stack of old receipts, I found 3 rejection letters from different banks, all dated within the last year. First National turned Parker down for a business loan in January. Citizens Bank rejected his application for a line of credit in March. Community Trust said no to refinancing the store in May. Each letter had notes in Parker's handwriting, calculating how much time we had left before Keith's next payment. I could see his desperation growing worse with each rejection. Ryan called and said his brother, Dexter, could look at our books if I wanted a real financial expert's opinion. Dexter showed up that afternoon with a laptop and started going through everything with the kind of focused intensity that made me nervous. Within an hour, he found something that made him whistle low. He turned his screen towards me and showed bank records proving Delia's account received deposits matching exactly what Parker needed for each payment to Keith. She wasn't just dating him. She was helping him hide the money trail from anyone who might look. $20,000 here, $15,000 there, always right before Keith's deadlines. Dexter said this meant she knew everything and was actively helping Parker protect the family. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from someone named Bethany Lane, saying she was the assistant DA handling Parker's case. She needed to talk to me about the developer deposit Parker took and said my cooperation was crucial. Her voice sounded professional, but there was something urgent underneath it. I realized I was stuck between helping prosecute my brother and dealing with Keith's threats. That evening, Keith texted, saying he wanted to meet at the diner on Route 9 to discuss our situation. I drove there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Keith was already in a back booth, drinking coffee when I walked in. He stood up and shook my hand like we were doing normal business. He told me Parker was smart enough to negotiate reasonable terms, and he respected that. He asked if I was equally smart or if I was going to make this difficult for everyone. I told him I needed more time to figure out a solution that worked for both sides. He smiled. "Time is expensive," he said, "but I'll give you a little more, as a professional courtesy." Ryan called me right after I left the diner and warned me not to make any payments without seeing proof of the original debt. He said these kinds of debts sometimes get sold and resold until nobody really knows who owns what. We might have leverage if the paperwork wasn't clean. He wanted to see every document Keith had before we gave them another dollar. The next morning, I was opening the store when the phone rang, and our main supplier's credit manager told me our account was frozen. We owed $30,000, and without immediate payment, they couldn't ship us anything. I looked at the empty shelves where paint should be and realized we couldn't fill orders without supplies. No supplies meant no sales, and no sales meant no money to pay anyone. Everything was falling apart faster than I could handle. Chad texted, asking if we could meet at the coffee shop downtown because he had a business proposition. I didn't want to deal with him, but I was running out of options. He was waiting with a folder when I got there. He opened it and showed me a simple offer, to buy our excess inventory at 60 cents on the dollar. It wasn't charity, he explained, since he'd wanted our supplier contracts for years anyway. The cash would help, but it felt like admitting defeat to my biggest rival. I told him I'd think about it, and he said not to think too long because the offer had an expiration date. Dexter called with more analysis, showing Parker's payments to Delia matched Keith's collection schedule perfectly, down to the day. If the DA froze her accounts, we might recover some money, but it also proved Delia was helping protect us this whole time. She wasn't the selfish person I thought she was. Everything I believed about everyone was turning out to be wrong. Bethany Lane finally reached me and asked if I could come to her office that afternoon. She sat across from me in a gray suit and explained that if I cooperated fully with the prosecution, she could probably freeze Delia's accounts. The money would be held as evidence, but eventually some might come back to us. She needed my statement about Parker's activities and the public confrontation at the store. She said I had until tomorrow morning to decide if I wanted to help or not. The irony made me sick. To think that prosecuting Parker might be the only way to save what was left of our family. I headed back to the office that evening and started going through more of Dad's old files. That's when I found a thick folder marked medical that I'd never seen before. Inside were dozens of insurance denial letters from 3 years ago, all stamped with red rejection marks across the top. The insurance company refused to cover experimental stroke treatments that cost $50,000 per session. Dad needed at least 6 sessions, according to the doctor's notes, but insurance called it unnecessary and unproven. Parker must have been trying to pay for these treatments on top of everything else, while I sat there calling him lazy and drunk. The papers showed Parker had appealed the denials 4 times, even hired a medical advocate, but nothing worked. My hands shook as I read letter after letter, describing how these treatments might have helped Dad walk and talk again. The anger I'd been carrying toward Parker started shifting to this whole broken system that left families to choose between bankruptcy and watching loved ones suffer. I stayed at the store late that night, sitting at the register with the cash drawer open, counting bills over and over. We had $2,000 in small bills from today's sales, plus another 1,000 in the safe from yesterday. The payroll list showed 8 employees who needed checks on Friday, totaling $12,000. If I couldn't figure something out by then, 8 families would lose their income, including 3 single moms who'd worked here since Dad opened the place. The weight of responsibility Parker had been carrying for 3 years suddenly felt like it was crushing my chest. I kept recalculating, hoping the numbers would change, but they stayed the same no matter how many times I counted. My phone rang. Ryan's name. I answered immediately, desperate for good news. He told me he'd been digging into the creditors' paperwork and discovered they'd filed their confession of judgment in a county 2 hours away. That county had judges known for being less strict about documentation requirements, which made the filing legally questionable, but still enforceable. Our options for fighting this were getting smaller, while their leverage kept growing every day. He said we could challenge the venue, but it would take months and cost money we didn't have. The smart play was negotiating a settlement, but that required cash up front, which brought us back to the same problem. I hung up, feeling worse than before his call. The next morning, Mom came to the store, and I had to tell her the truth about our situation. I explained we might need to close half the store and let go of most employees just to survive the next month. She aged 10 years right in front of me as the words sank in. But she nodded slowly, understanding we were past the point of good choices. We weren't choosing between winning and losing anymore, just picking which disasters we could live with. She asked about the employees' families, and I had no answer that wouldn't break her heart more. My phone buzzed with a text from Chad, saying he'd wired a deposit for the inventory he wanted to buy. $20,000, sitting in a wire transfer. It should have made me happy, but Ryan immediately called, saying we needed to put it in escrow. He wanted to confirm no liens existed on the inventory before releasing the funds, which was smart, but frustrating when we needed cash today, not next week. Every solution we found created 3 new problems, and I was running out of energy to keep fighting them all. Bethany called, asking me to come to her office that afternoon for more questions about Parker's case. She grilled me for 2 hours about the public confrontation with Parker and whether I knew about any hidden assets he might have stashed. I had to walk a careful line, cooperating enough to help, but not saying anything that would hurt what was left of our family. She seemed sympathetic to our situation, but kept reminding me she had a job to do and the law didn't care about family drama. She asked specifically about Delia's involvement, and I told her what I knew without mentioning the payment connections Dexter had found. When she asked if I thought Parker acted alone, I said I didn't know anymore, which was the complete truth. Dexter called that night with worse news. After reviewing the full debt agreement, he'd found a clause buried on page 18 that triggered an interest rate jump to 40% annually if we missed even one payment. The math made my stomach turn. 40% on $500,000 meant $200,000 in interest alone each year. Parker had been walking a tightrope I never even knew existed, where one mistake would have destroyed everything instantly. Dexter said these predatory clauses were technically legal, but morally disgusting, and judges sometimes threw them out if you had the right lawyer and enough time. We had neither. I drove out to Dad's old storage unit that evening and stared at his 1988 Ford truck that he'd restored himself. Parker loved that truck almost as much as Dad did and used to spend weekends working on it with him. The blue paint was fading, but the engine still ran perfect, and I knew a collector who'd pay $8,000 for it. My hands shook as I took photos to send to the buyer, knowing I was undoing another one of Parker's sacrifices. He could have sold this truck anytime for quick cash, but kept it preserved like a museum piece of better days. The buyer came within an hour and handed me $800 bills that felt heavier than they should. The next morning, our paint supplier called. I braced myself for another blow, but instead, he offered something unexpected. He said Dad had helped him start his business 20 years ago with a personal loan when banks wouldn't touch him. He wanted to extend us partial credit for paint supplies, even though our account was technically frozen. These small acts of kindness, from people who remembered who we used to be, gave me strength to keep fighting when everything else felt hopeless. Not everyone had forgotten the family we were before all this mess. Mom came to the store that afternoon, carrying an old photo in a wooden frame that she'd found in the attic. The picture showed the store's grand opening, with Dad standing proud in front while Parker and I sat on his shoulders as little kids. All three of us were smiling like we'd won the lottery. Mom said Dad talked about that day until his stroke. I put the photo next to the register where I'd see it every time I rang up a sale. It helped focus my determination on something bigger than just survival. Because we weren't just fighting for a building full of hardware. We were fighting for everything that photo represented and everything Dad had built with his own hands before the world got complicated and cruel. Ryan called that afternoon, saying Keith would agree to meet, but only if we posted $10,000 immediately as good faith money to show we were serious about negotiating. I scraped together $8,000 from the register and safe, plus another $2,000 from my personal savings account that was supposed to be for emergencies. Ryan warned me, these kinds of negotiations rarely go smooth, and we're basically just buying ourselves time to figure out a real solution. The money transfer went through within an hour, and Keith's office sent back a confirmation with a meeting time for next week. Meanwhile, Bethany moved fast on freezing Delia's accounts and managed to grab $12,000 before Delia's lawyer showed up with paperwork blocking the rest. The lawyers started screaming about illegal seizure and threatening their own lawsuit against me personally for defamation and harassment. Bethany said it was something, but nowhere near enough to make a real difference in our debt situation. Now Delia's whole family was calling the store, making threats about how they were going to sue us into the ground for destroying her reputation. Every time we tried to fix one problem, we just created 3 new enemies who wanted their own piece of us. Dexter spent 2 days going through every single expense at the store and finally produced a clean analysis showing exactly what we could afford. If we cut staff hours by 30% and stopped all unnecessary purchases, we could manage $15,000 monthly payments. It would be brutal and barely leave enough to keep the lights on, but the numbers actually worked on paper, he said. Having real numbers instead of just fear would give us something concrete to negotiate with when we met Keith. I spent the next morning writing out a simple statement for the court, accepting responsibility for my actions against Parker. Ryan helped me find the right balance between being honest about what I did, while still explaining Parker's situation without making excuses. The truth was way more complicated than any courtroom could really understand, but we had to try anyway. Parker's public defender would use my statement to argue for reduced charges based on the family circumstances. The phone rang that evening, and it was Parker calling collect from county jail again. He asked if Mom was safe, and said that was all that really mattered to him now that everything else was falling apart. His voice broke when he said he was sorry for everything he'd put me through, even though he was just trying to protect us. I told him I understood now, and that I was working on fixing everything with Ryan's help. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years without all the anger and resentment between us. Chad stopped by the store the next day with an unexpected offer about sharing supplier contracts if we survived this mess. He said competition was good, but having 2 strong hardware stores in town would be better for everyone than one store dying. It was pure business on his part, but the shared contracts could help both stores get better prices and survive the big box stores moving into the area. Mom came over that night and finally admitted something she'd been hiding for years about Dad's stroke. She'd pressured Dad to keep Parker in charge because she thought I was too young to handle the pressure of running the store. She wanted to protect me, the same way Parker had been trying to protect all of us from the debt collectors. Everyone was lying to everyone else, trying to protect each other, and it almost destroyed our whole family. The next morning, Ryan drafted a formal forbearance proposal, offering to pay $12,000 monthly, using the store inventory and partial house equity as collateral. It was aggressive, but showed Keith we were serious about resolving this debt instead of just running away from it. Dexter thought it might actually work if we presented it right and showed them the numbers, proving we could maintain payments. He'd also been digging through government programs and found a small tax credit for businesses supporting disabled owners like Dad. There was also a state grant for family businesses in crisis that could give us another few thousand if we qualified. Together, they might provide $8,000, which could be the difference between surviving and losing everything. These programs existed to help people like us, but nobody ever told you about them unless you knew where to look. The gossip around town about Parker's arrest was getting worse every day, with people adding their own details to the story. I made a conscious decision to stop talking about it publicly and told the employees not to discuss it with customers anymore. My need for vindication and revenge had created this whole mess in the first place. Some victories just weren't worth winning if they destroyed everything else in the process. The town gossip would have to find some other entertainment besides our family's problems. Ryan scheduled the big meeting with Keith for the following Tuesday and said we needed to go in strong, but flexible. We had our payment proposal and the numbers to back it up, but we also needed to be ready to negotiate if they pushed back. Keith was a businessman who understood money better than emotions, so we had to speak his language. The $10,000 good faith payment had bought us this meeting, but it wouldn't buy us any sympathy or special treatment. I spent the weekend going through every possible scenario with Ryan and Dexter, trying to prepare for whatever Keith might throw at us. Monday night, Ryan had us meet at his office to go over everything one more time before Tuesday's meeting. Dexter spread out all the financial documents on the conference table while Ryan wrote key points on a whiteboard. I kept reading the numbers over and over until they stuck in my brain, because I couldn't afford to forget anything important. Ryan made me practice saying the payment amounts without my voice shaking, while Dexter pretended to be Keith, asking hard questions. We went through different scenarios. What if Keith demanded more money, or wanted the store immediately, or threatened to call in the whole debt? Ryan kept telling me not to show fear, because guys like Keith could smell weakness and would use it against us. I practiced keeping my hands still on the table instead of fidgeting, and looking Keith straight in the eye even when scared. Dexter suggested we bring copies of everything to show we were organized and serious about making this work. Ryan agreed and started making folders with tabs for each section of our proposal. We stayed until almost midnight, running through every possible question Keith might ask and practicing our answers. My voice got steadier each time I went through the numbers, but my stomach still felt like it was full of rocks. Ryan said that was normal and even good because it meant I was taking this seriously enough to be nervous. The next morning, I put on my only suit and drove to Ryan's office an hour early because I couldn't sleep anyway. Ryan was already there, reviewing notes and making sure we had everything we needed for the meeting. Dexter showed up with fresh coffee and more copies of the payment projections, in case Keith's guys wanted their own. Keith arrived exactly at 10 o'clock with two men who looked like they could break me in half without trying. They sat across from us at the conference table, and Keith just stared at me while his guys whispered to each other. I started presenting our offer, explaining how $12,000 monthly would work with the store's cash flow and inventory sales. Keith didn't move or change his expression while I talked, just watched me like he was deciding something important. His guys kept whispering and passing notes back and forth, which made me more nervous with every word. The silence after I finished talking went on so long, I wanted to fill it with more words, but Ryan touched my arm to keep me quiet. Keith finally leaned back and said $18,000 monthly was the minimum he'd accept, plus a $50,000 restructuring fee up front. The number hit me like a punch, because we didn't have anywhere close to $50,000 in cash. Ryan calmly pointed out that the original debt documentation had some questionable elements that might not hold up under legal review. Keith's expression didn't change, but one of his guys stopped whispering and paid attention to what Ryan was saying. Ryan explained that a court might find the interest rates violated state usury laws and the confession of judgment wasn't properly notarized. Keith asked if we really wanted to test that theory in court while the debt kept growing every day. The air in the room felt so thick I could barely breathe while they stared at each other. Ryan suggested a middle ground where we'd escrow $15,000 monthly, using the store inventory as primary collateral. He added we could include a limited lien on Mom's house that would only activate if we missed 2 payments in a row. Keith looked at his guys, who nodded slightly, then back at Ryan, who kept his face completely calm. Every second Keith stayed quiet felt like an hour passing, while my heart pounded so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Keith asked what would stop us from just emptying the store and disappearing once we had breathing room. Ryan explained the escrow would be managed by a neutral third party who'd verify inventory levels monthly. Keith's phone buzzed, and he stepped out to take the call, leaving us sitting there with his two guys watching us. Ryan used the break to remind me to stay calm and let him handle the negotiation from here. When Keith came back, he said he needed to think about it and would give us an answer after lunch. We spent the break in Ryan's office, where my phone rang with Bethany's name on the screen. She said Parker qualified for a plea deal that would keep him out of prison if he agreed to restitution and treatment. The deal included 6 months in a treatment facility instead of jail, plus 3 years of probation. She needed to know if I'd support the deal at his sentencing hearing that afternoon. I told her yes immediately, because Parker getting out meant he could help save the store. Ryan said it was good timing, because Keith might see Parker's availability as additional security for the payments. We went back to the conference room where Keith was already waiting with a handwritten agreement. He said 90 days at $15,000 monthly. Then we'll review, based on your payment history, and maybe adjust terms. Ryan read through it carefully and said it was the best deal we'd get under the circumstances. My hand shook as I signed my name on the line that made me responsible for Dad's massive debt. Keith's guys witnessed the signatures, and Keith said he expected the first payment in 3 days. After they left, Ryan called Chad to confirm the inventory purchase so we'd have money for the payment. Chad wired the funds within an hour, taking $40,000 in inventory for $24,000 cash. The money went straight into the escrow account Ryan had set up that morning. Our main paint supplier called Ryan's office and said they'd reviewed our new payment structure and would reinstate limited credit. They'd give us net 30 terms on up to $10,000 in monthly orders if we stayed current. It wasn't much, but it meant we could keep the shelves stocked and fill customer orders. Mom came to Ryan's office that afternoon to sign the lien paperwork with tears running down her face. Ryan promised her the house was safe as long as we made every payment on time, without fail. She hugged me and whispered that Dad would be proud of how I was handling this mess. I drove to the courthouse for Parker's hearing, my suit still damp with sweat from the morning meeting. The courtroom was almost empty, except for Parker in an orange jumpsuit and Bethany at the prosecutor's table. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before he ruled on the plea agreement. I stood up and told the judge Parker had been trying to protect our family from a dangerous debt. I kept it short and factual, explaining the circumstances without making excuses for the theft itself. The judge looked at Parker and asked if he understood the terms of his plea deal. Parker said yes, in a voice so quiet I barely heard it from where I was sitting. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced Parker to 6 months in treatment with credit for time served. Parker turned to look at me and mouthed the words, "Thank you," before the bailiff led him away. Bethany caught up with me in the courthouse hallway and handed me the final plea agreement papers that showed Parker would get 18 months probation with monthly restitution payments going straight toward our family debt. The counseling program started immediately at a state facility 40 miles away. If he stayed clean and made every payment, he'd avoid prison completely. I signed as the victim where she pointed and watched her file it with the clerk who stamped it 3 times and gave us certified copies. That evening, Mom and I sat at the kitchen table, going through every secret Dad had kept from us and every lie Parker told to protect us. She pulled out old bank statements showing mysterious deposits she'd ignored and letters from collectors she'd thrown away, thinking they were mistakes. We wrote down everything on a yellow legal pad and agreed to meet every Sunday night once Parker got out, to make sure nobody hid anything ever again. The next morning, I started changing everything at the store. Printing new price tags with clear numbers, setting up an inventory system on the computer that tracked every single item. The employees helped me reorganize the shelves and seemed happy to finally have rules that made sense, instead of Parker's random decisions. I typed up a simple letter on the store letterhead, explaining that we were under new management and would honor all warranties and returns just like Dad used to do. Most customers who got the letter came in that week to shake my hand and buy something just to show support. 3 days later, I drove to the bank with $15,000 in cash and a cashier's check that Ryan had prepared for our first payment to Keith. The teller counted everything twice and gave me a receipt that I immediately faxed to Keith's office from the bank's machine. Dexter called within an hour to confirm they'd received it and reminded me to keep every single receipt in a fireproof safe because perfect payment history was our only leverage for renegotiating later. 2 weeks after that, I drove to the treatment facility where Parker was staying, in a plain brick building surrounded by a chain-link fence. We sat in plastic chairs in a common room that smelled like disinfectant, while other patients played cards at nearby tables. Parker looked thinner, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. He showed me the schedule they had him on, with group therapy and individual counseling every day. We talked about inventory systems and which suppliers gave the best terms, and how to handle difficult customers without losing our temper. He wrote down ideas on a notepad they'd given him, and we set up a system where I'd email him weekly sales reports so he could give input even from inside. Before I left, he asked me to tell Mom he was sorry, and I said she already knew, but I'd tell her anyway. That night, Mom went to bed at 9:30 and didn't get up once to check the locks or peek out the windows like she'd been doing for months. I heard her snoring softly through her bedroom door and realized it was the first time she'd really slept since this whole mess started. The next morning, I got to the store at 5, like always, and turned on all the lights before unlocking the front door. Dad's photo sat next to the register in the same wooden frame from his office. I'd taped our payment schedule inside the cash drawer where I'd see it every single morning. The ledger showed we were current on everything for the first time in years, with supplier bills paid and payroll covered, and even some money left for repairs. I counted the till twice and checked that all the receipts were filed correctly in the new system I'd created. The payment plan reminded me we weren't safe yet, but at least we were fighting back with a real plan instead of just hiding and hoping things would get better. What would you have done if you found yourself in a mess like this, realizing everything you thought was true turned out to be a carefully constructed lie? Tell me what you think in the comments. I really want to know.